So when we left off, Rome had expanded into Germania and had kept a dominant hold on not just the Mediterranean, but Central Europe and eventually the North. The Romans eliminated any of the native cultures and assimilated everyone into the Roman culture. After a few hundred years, this leaves most of Europe dominantly Roman and very united. Eventually, Rome becomes so strong that after years of expansion, the empire begins to focus on other civilizations across the Old World, such as China, Persia, and the Indian empires. If Rome would want to survive, they would need to trade. This would mean expanding their influence outside of just Europe. In a world where Rome would dominate Europe, there would be very little differentiation by the outside world between Rome and Europe. Rome would control so much of Europe that the landmass and the empire would be seen as one and the same. First off would be Rome's relationship with the Parthians, also known as the Persians or Iranians. Rome and Parthia have a very complex history with one another, and both were always very active in military clashes and invasions for hundreds of years. Both were involved in each other's civil wars and foreign interests. If Rome never fell, it's safe to assume this hatred would continue by the 400s while Parthia fell and was replaced by the Sasanians. Rome and the Sasanians would most likely fight a series of wars between one another in Mesopotamia, and each side never gains a significant advantage. And then in the 600s out of Arabia, the new religion of Islam spreads just like in our timeline, and the Islamic Empire begins a war against the Romans and the Sasanians. We can see that in our timeline during the Arab-Byzantine Wars. The areas of Syria, Egypt, and other areas of the Middle East quickly came under Islamic influence. Would a strong Roman Empire stop this expansion? Well, it's difficult to say. Many factors would have had to gone into Rome winning the war against Arab expansion. For one, Rome would have had to have the resources to defend the Middle East, and after years of war with the Sasanians, would they be able to? Probably not. If Rome controlled the area from Britain to Mesopotamia, it's easy to say that their resources would be strained by trying to hold a brand new enemy in the Middle East, especially after the wars against the Sasanians. Rome, as a Christian-dominated empire, would feel needed to defend Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Islam, so perhaps this zeal would help Rome defend their territory. So we can assume that there would be a massive war between the Romans and the Arabs in the Middle East. We don't know who would win, but since Rome would already have to maintain such a large area, I would say that Rome would lose the war. Yet the Arabs control a smaller amount of land than they would in our timeline. The Sasanians would most likely fall to the Arabs due to their closeness to Arabia, and Islam would spread into Persia and Central Asia. With this, it would cut the Asian continent in half just as the Ottomans did in our timeline. The Romans would have to invade Numidia and Upper Somalia to then be able to trade with the Indian kingdoms and China. Thus, the Roman Empire would have to expand even further into Africa. The Christian Romans and Islamic Arabs would wage war across the Red Sea, competing for Somalia and Northeast Africa. This new war would make the Romans and Arabs massive enemies who would block almost all communication from each other. By around 900, the Catholic Church has become a dominant force in the Roman Empire. The Church would have a major say in the empire's politics and current events, as well as the religious influence of the emperors. This power would heavily influence the Romans in a competing war with Islam. For almost hundreds of years, the two regions of Rome and Arabia would constantly fight in Mesopotamia, the Holy Land, and Africa. The consequence of this would be that Roman influence would spread into the Red Sea as well as more into Mesopotamia. These holy wars would help unite the fractured empire, and the northern European Romans as well as the southern Romans would fight a holy war against the Arabs. Now, the Islamists were very cultured people. Their empire was very much like Rome. It taught in arts, maths, and the sciences. They built monumental architecture and infrastructure across the Middle East, and in fact, in our actual timeline, Muslim scholars saved Roman scrolls and documents while Europe was in disarray after the collapse of Rome. The Islamist civilization also plays key parts in our lives today. Numbers that we know, such as 1, 2, or 3, were invented by the Arabs. This is why we call these Arabic numerals. If the Romans had kept a hold on the Middle East and Europe, Western civilization would practice in using Roman numerals for math and science. If a war would be constant between the West and Islam, our two cultures would be even more apart and foreign than they are today. Now, after these wars, the Romans and Islamists would focus their attention elsewhere and would reach out to other civilizations and empires to help their cause and build relations. The Romans would be very limited in this, as the Islamists would be closer to China, India, and Southeast Asia. This would already complicate relationships with the rest of the world, who would already have good relations with the Arabs. But eventually Rome would establish trade with China, India, and Southeast Asia, mostly trading through sea by Somalia or the Red Sea. This type of connection would make the two sides of the world know more about one another and create a new type of peace between the East and West. The Romans would not see the Chinese, Indians, or Southeast Asian civilizations as lesser, but as equal to their own Roman Empire, another form of civilization on the other side of the world which would offer new trade and luxurious commodities such as silk and paper. This peace would last for almost 200 years, and then came the Mongols. We'll talk about that next time. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.